Earlier in this day of training, you created an item renderer for the data group container and then applied it to two Spark list controls. In the last exercise, you used the data grid control to display data. In this video, you will bring your knowledge of item renderers to the data grid control and learn how to create inline item renderers and item editors. You will also learn how to create component item renderers and editors. Then you will learn how to set an item renderer as an item editor. Lastly, you will learn how to handle a user click on a cell in the data grid control. This is the application that you built in the last exercise. By default, a data grid control displays only one data field per column, but you implemented a formatter to display two data fields in this first column. Note, however, that you displayed these two data fields in one text string by concatenating them together. In order to display components in a data grid column, you must create an item renderer for that column. In this video, I will create this item renderer for the first column, which displays not only the employee name data, but also an image of the employee. I will also show you how to handle a click on a record in the control. Lastly, I will create an item editor, which allows a user to edit the data in the data grid control. This is the main starter application for this example. You can see that I am retrieving employee information in this HTTP service call and then populating the employee list array collection variable with the data using the result handler. When I run the file, you can see that the data grid displays the employee's full name and hire date. Back in the code, I'm adding a third instance of the grid column control and setting the data field property to evaluation and the header text property to evaluation. Remember that the data field property references the data from the employees.xml file in the data package of this project. This data represents the quarterly performance evaluation score for each employee. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that a third column was added, but the column is very small. I'm returning to Flash Builder and to the data item instance inside of the typical item property. I am referencing the evaluation data object and setting its value to evaluation. This will make the last column as wide as the word evaluation. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that that is true. Now let's take a closer look at item renderers and item editors. The data grid control uses one text field as the default item renderer and one text input field as the default item editor. You can create a custom item renderer or editor to customize the appearance and behavior of your data grid control. Visually, item renderers and item editors behave differently. An item renderer is used as the default display, while an item editor is only used when an item is being edited. You can set the item renderer to act as an item editor by setting the renderer is editor property to true. The data that is stored in the data provider property of the data grid control for each record is available to an item renderer or editor in the data property. Since renderers and editors can display multiple data values, you control the value that is being edited by the item editor with the value property and make sure that you make it a two-way binding. This will ensure that the edited value is updated in both the data provider and the item renderer display. You can implement item renderer and item editors in two ways, as inline or component code. Note that the only difference between the two is structural. The former puts code inline to the data grid instance, while the latter puts the code into a component file. The first step to create an inline item renderer or editor is to create the item renderer or item editor properties as nested properties of the grid column instance rather than as properties in the tag. Within the nested property tag block, you will then add a component tag block. Within that, you can add your visual controls, which can be simple or complex displays. This code sample shows an item editor property nested inside a grid column block. Within that is a component block that specifies a new scope for the item editor. Within the component block is the grid item editor class instance. Within this class, you can place a control for display. This is very similar to creating item renderers for the data group container that you learned how to create at the beginning of this day of training. If you have more than one control to display in your editor or renderer, you should place the controls within a container. This code, now for an item renderer, shows the label and bitmap image controls nested within a vgroup container. It also shows the use of the item renderer property instead of the item editor property and the grid item renderer class instead of the grid item editor class. Back in the main application file, I'm changing the evaluation grid column instance from single tag syntax to block syntax. Within the grid column block, I'm adding an inline item renderer property block. Inside the item renderer property block, I'm adding a component block, and within that, I'm adding a grid item renderer block. In the grid item renderer block, I'm adding a label control and giving it a text property that binds the value of the data object's evaluation. Remember that all data stored in the data provider property is referenced through the data property when you're inside of an item renderer or an item editor. Next, I'm adding the height property with a value of 100%, the right property with a value of 10, the vertical align property with a value of middle, the font weight property with a value of bold, and the font style property with a value of italic. I'm saving the file and running the application. You can see that the text in the evaluation column of the data grid control still displays the evaluation data, but is now formatted. A complex inline item renderer might be better built as a separate component. If you create a component item renderer, you will have greater flexibility and functionality. In addition, it is easier to reuse your item renderer if it is a component. You have to build your item renderer or item editor component in a separate file. These components can be written in either MXML or ActionScript. The data for each item in the column is referenced as the data property and is passed to the component, whereby the component determines how the data is displayed. Back in Flash Builder, I am right-clicking on the source folder and selecting New Item Renderer. In the New Item Renderer dialog box, I am typing components for the package and employee display for the name. I'm selecting Item Renderer for Spark Data Grid from the template drop-down list and clicking Finish. The employee display component has opened in the editor view. I'm deleting everything between the grid item renderer tags and adding an instance of the vgroup container. Within the container, I'm adding a label control and giving it a text property that uses the first name in the data object, followed by a literal space, and then the data.last name. Under the label control, I'm adding a bitmap image control and setting the source property value to images/data.id.jpg. To the opening grid item renderer tag, I'm adding width and height properties with values set to 100. Now I'm saving the file and switching back to the main application file. I'm removing the label function property from the grid column instance that displays the employee's name. To the same instance of the grid column, I am adding the ItemRenderer property and setting its value to point to the employee display custom component in the components package. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the name column of the DataGrid control now displays both the employee names and images. Notice that the names and images are not centered, and you may not be able to see the whole DataGrid control in the browser. To the DataGrid control, I'm adding a height property with a value of 600. I'm saving the file and switching to the employee display component file. To the opening tag of the vGroup container, I'm adding the horizontal align and vertical align properties and setting their values to center and middle, respectively. Next, I'm adding the width and height properties and setting both values to 100%. I'm saving the file and running the application. You can see that the employee data in the name column is now centered within the column, and the DataGrid control is contained within the browser. Notice that the DataGrid control is not editable. As you know, the display that you view in a cell of the DataGrid control is an item renderer. When you double-click on an editable cell, you are presented with the display for an item editor. Like the item renderer, by default the item editor is a text field. Next, I will apply the numeric stepper control as an item renderer for the evaluation score, and then set it to display as the item editor as well. So back here in this code, I'm adding the editable property to the DataGrid instance with a value of true. I'm saving the file and running the application. Notice that every cell in the DataGrid is editable if I double-click into it. I'm returning to the main application file. In a DataGrid control, to make any column editable, you must turn on editability for the entire control, and then turn off editability on the columns that should not be editable. I'm adding the editable property to the employee name and hire date columns and setting their values to false. When I save the file and run the application, you can see now that only the evaluation column is editable. Back in the main application file, I am locating the grid item renderer block for the evaluation column and commenting out the label control within the block using the keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on the Mac. Within the grid item renderer block, I'm adding an instance of the numeric stepper control, saving the file and running the application. The evaluation column now displays a numeric stepper control for the item renderer, but all the values are set to 0. I'm returning to the main application file and adding the value property to the numeric stepper control and giving it a value that binds to data.evaluation. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the evaluation column now shows the correct data. Also notice that I can change the value in the numeric stepper, but if I change the value to a number larger than 10, it switches back to 10. This occurs because the numeric stepper has a default maximum value of 10. I'm returning to the main application file, and to the numeric stepper control, I'm adding the maximum property and setting it to a value of 100. I'm also setting the width property to 100% so that the column takes up the entire column width. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the component now fills the entire column and the column header shows its entire value. You will also note that the maximum number in the numeric stepper is now 100. If I type a number larger than 100, the numeric stepper will switch the number to 100 as it did before. When I double-click the numeric stepper, notice that the item editor is still a text field. To the grid column control for the evaluation data, I'm adding the renderer is editable property and setting its value to true. I'm saving the file and running the application again. When I double-click on an item in the evaluation column, you can see that there's no longer a text field. This occurs because the item editor is now the numeric stepper control defined in the item renderer. Now I want to use the item editor property to create an inline item editor. So back in this main application file, I am removing the renderer is editable property from the evaluation grid column instance. I'm locating the inline item renderer property and changing it to an item editor property. I'm also changing the grid item renderer instance to a grid item editor instance. I'm saving the file, and you can see that I get a warning message that says data binding will not be able to detect assignments to data. I'm running the application. Notice that when I try to edit the last column, the value in the numeric stepper control is 0. Also notice that when I change the number, the item renderer returns to the original evaluation score. I'm returning to the main application, and to the numeric stepper control, I'm changing the value property to a binding to value. The value in the binding is a property of the grid item editor instance and holds the value of the data that's being edited. You use the @ sign to create a two-way binding so that when a user updates the numeric stepper, the data in the data provider updates too. When I save the file, the warning message goes away. I'm running the application. Now when I edit the evaluation column, the value in the numeric stepper starts at the original evaluation score. When I change the value, the numeric stepper is properly updated. Now I want to create a component item editor. Back in Flash Builder, I am right-clicking on the Components package and selecting New MXML Component. In the New MXML Component dialog, I am typing Employee Evaluation for the name. I'm basing the component on the Grid Item Editor class and removing the width and height values. I'm clicking Finish. The new component file opens in the editor view, and I'm returning to the main application file. I'm cutting the numeric stepper control and pasting it under the declarations block in the employee evaluation component file. I'm saving that file and returning again to the main application file. I'm removing the ItemEditor property block and its contents and modifying the evaluation grid column instance so that it uses a single tag syntax. To the same grid column instance, I'm adding the ItemEditor property and setting its value to reference the components package and the employee evaluation class. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the application has not changed. For the last section of this video, I will show you how to capture and handle a user click on a cell. When a selection is made in a data grid control, a selection change event is broadcasted. The item selected is in the selected item property, which holds the data for the selected record in the data provider property. Now I will show you how to handle the selection change event when a record in this data grid control is clicked. I will also show you how to display an alert message that tells you the name of the selected employee when you click the record. To this data grid control, I'm adding the selection change event and generating the event handler, which I am control clicking on. Within the selection change handler function, I'm removing the generated code stub and using the content assist tool, control space, to add the alert.show method. You can see that because I used content assist to add the alert.show method, the alert control class was automatically imported. Within the method, I'm adding the string uSelected concatenated with the value event.currentTarget.selectedItem.firstName. Separated by a comma, I'm adding the title heading for the alert dialog box that reads Employee Portal Notification. I'm saving the file and running the application. When I click on a cell in the alert dialog, you can see the alert message appears displaying the name of the employee I selected. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Creating and Using Item Renderers and Item Editors.